Now, other laws, dismemberment laws. Dismemberment laws. This is an easy one that you're familiar with. This is the Lex talionis. This is eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Now you say, what's the deal with that? So he punches out your tooth, you what? You punch out his tooth. Okay, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Well, I'll be toothless, right? And so how is that justice? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Well, let me just say, is it justice? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In other words, what this law is trying to say is that the punishment is to equal the crime. That the punishment is to equal the crime. Now, what can happen in certain cultures, i.e. Hammurabi's Code, some of the other cultures, is it possible that you knock someone's tooth out, if the person's the king, he takes off your head for knocking his tooth out? And so what this is saying is you can't overreact. In other words, you're tooth for tooth. The damage you did is the punishment you receive. It has to be equal. You can't overreact and the king say, I'm the king, he knocked out my tooth, take off his head. Okay? And some of the other cultures, there's this overreaction. If you do something wrong, there's this total overreaction. And eye for an eye, tooth for tooth says the crime and the punishment must fit each other. The punishment and crime must fit each other. So is this actually helpful in a crime, that a person doesn't overreact? Have any of you guys ever been in situations like that where there's vengeance going on, where somebody does something to the person and the other person responds, and he responds harder and harsher, and then this person responds back harder and harsher, and it just gets to go up. It escalates. And what the law is saying is, no, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, as it has been done, so the punishment must match the crime. The other thing with this, and this happens in America, let's suppose, I was just watching last night, it was kind of interesting. There's a guy comes in to rob a 7-Eleven store, okay? Let's say he's got a gun on him, and there's a 72-year-old grandmother, this is at 1 o'clock in the morning, who's out talking to the guy at 7-Eleven store. The guy comes in to rob the store. You know what Granny does? This is the honest truth, man. This grandmother grabs this, the scanner thing, and she starts whacking on this guy. This guy's trying to steal the stuff, and Granny's going like this. It's all caught on camera. It's the funniest thing. She's beating on this guy. The guy steals the stuff. He runs out of the store. Now, let's suppose he gets caught in America. He stole $100. He got a head injury from grandma. Okay. She won. It was pretty impressive. I wouldn't want to tangle with that woman. But anyways, so in our culture, what happens to the guy? He stole the $100. He's got a gun on him, stuff, it's armed robbery or something like that. What would happen to him? Would he get put in jail? Armed robbery? I would hope he'd get put in jail, okay? So in America, do we incarcerate people? Do we incarcerate people for punishments? How many people are in jail in America? Yes. Somebody say that again. Is it 2 million? Is it 2 or 3 million?
Oh, no, I said 2.
2 million? That's the figure 2 million sticks in my head. Now, I'm not sure. I don't know. You're probably right. I think that figure sticks in my head. 2 million people incarcerated. Is that a lot of people in prison? By the way, does that cost America a bunch of money, actually, to keep people incarcerated? What's it cost to have somebody incarcerated for a year? Is it like over $30,000, right, to incarcerate people? And by the way, if you're from California, okay, hopefully nobody's from California, but if you're from California, Massachusetts is a good place to be, better in California. But if you're from California and stuff, did they have so many people incarcerated in their prisons and their budget, they're in debt? Remember, California is like underwater, like major billions underwater. And what they're saying is we can't afford to keep these people in prison anymore. And so they were going to set these guys loose on the street because we can't afford to keep them in our prisons anymore. Now, what's the problem in the ancient times, okay? What's the problem in ancient times? Did they have prisons in ancient times? Did the kings have access to a few prisons, but was it very, very few? Very, very few. Joseph was in prison, right? But it was a very, very few. It was only, like a king would have a prison stuff, but it would only be for a very few people. So what I'm saying is, when a person did a crime, could you have the privilege of putting that person in prison? If an armed robber comes in to rob a 7-Eleven in Bethlehem, are they going to they don't have a prison to put the guy in. Okay? And so what happens is they have to mete out justice immediately. In other words, they have to do justice immediately. You don't have prison-type things. And by the way, even with some of our prisons, did they ever try to do things immediately? Have you guys ever heard this, like if a guy steals something from somebody, that he actually has to go back and face the person he stole and repay like twice, 3 times, 4 times what he stole from that person and do that, is that actually a good thing? That he actually has to face the damage that what he's done on another person? Now, a person like, we've got major criminals like Bernie Madoff and stuff, he would face his, the people that he ripped off and he would laugh at them. Saying there seems to be very little or no remorse there. But there seems to be something in the Old Testament where, if you stole something, then you had to repay it 4 times and stuff. They didn't have prisons. You can't put them in prison. So therefore, if they do something and it destroys your hand, then you destroy their person's hand. So it's kind of like immediate justice is meted out, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Because of the lack of prisons, they have to do justice differently. Here's another one, polygamy laws. You say, holy cow, the Bible has polygamy laws on polygamy. Chapter 21, Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 15. If a man has 2 wives, and he loves one but not the other. You say, wait a minute, are you telling me the Bible approves of polygamy? God here is setting up a law, 21:15, guy has 2 wives. If he loves one and hates the other, there's a law in the Bible about that. Does that mean God approves of polygamy? No. God made what? Adam and Eve, 2 joined together, 1 flesh kind of thing. And so Scripture is very much for that. However, did people back then have polygamous relationships? Jacob, Rachel and Leah. Bilhah, Zilpah, handmaid, stuff like that. So anyways, what does this law do? This law protects whom? Which wife does it protect especially? Which wife needs protection? The unloved wife. And so what this law says, it says if a guy has got 2 wives, if a guy has 2 wives, maybe he doesn't have 2 wives, then you're also set. If he has 2 wives, the unloved wife is to be protected. He must treat her, he must feed her, he must treat her well and things. And the unloved wife's kids, they get part of the inheritance as normal kids. You can't disinherit the unloved wife. So does this law actually protect the unloved wife? Is it a good thing in a culture where there's polygamy? Yeah. Okay, now the best thing is that there's no polygamy. But if it says if there is, and in that culture there were ifs, and so God says, okay, if there's an unloved wife, you got to protect the unloved wife. So that's the polygamy laws, and this one gets either similar to this. Slavery laws. Chapter 15, verse 12. And basically, slavery laws. If a fellow Hebrew, a man or a woman, sells himself to you and serves you for 6 years, in the 7th year, what happens? He goes free. So yeah, there are slavery laws in the Bible. Does that mean the Bible approves of slavery? By the way, is this African-type slavery where you go over, capture people, bring them over on boats, drown them, put them over here, and then they're a slave to a person for the rest of their existence? Is this what this is? This is saying a guy sells himself to somebody, and then in the 7th year, he goes free. Why would a person sell themselves to somebody else? Yeah, so everybody says, John. Yeah, because basically your debt. In our culture, we would call this what? Indebted servitude. Okay, he's ahead of me here. Let me back off. Would some people call this bankruptcy? In other words, the guy's going bankrupt. He can't afford to feed his family. So what he does is, because he can't afford to feed his family, by the way, did they have famines back then? They had famines when you couldn't run to the grocery store. There was nothing to eat. Your family's going to starve, so you sell yourself to a rich person. You help him harvest his crops and stuff. Then you get what? You get food for your family. You can feed your family. After 6 years, you get to start over again. Okay? And so, yes, the Bible has slavery laws, but by the way, does it protect the slave? It protects the slave. So this is, okay, so these hard laws? But by the way, is their culture different than our culture? Yeah, and they do things differently, and of course, they're wrong. Okay? Did you see the irony there is that we look at that and we can sit in the seat of judgment, and what's ironic to me is this, is how very judgmental our culture has become if you don't fit into our little PC-ness that we have in the 21st century. And actually, over my years of teaching, I've seen students tighten up, so that last year I asked a student, what was the most important thing you got out of the Old Testament? And the guy says, God kills babies. And I'm saying, I hope you guys get past, that your thinking goes a little bit beyond that and stuff like that. And so what I'm saying is you gotta wrestle with real life, okay? You gotta wrestle with real life and a God who's bigger than you can imagine. And you just, you gotta kind of get out of your American ways of looking at things, but okay. Now, animal treatment. This is another one that's really interesting. Deuteronomy actually has laws regarding animals. And what are the laws regarding animals? Okay. Now, these laws do not apply to cats, of course. But I have all these cat jokes and things, but they don't go over too well with certain people. But anyways. Chapter 22, verse 10. For example, there are actually quite a few animal laws things. It says this: do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. Now, why does it say don't plow with an ox and a donkey together? Is an ox a massive animal? Can an ox pull a plow really well? Because it's a really strong animal. A donkey is what? A little skinny animal that, you know what I'm saying? Are donkeys good to ride on, but are they good necessarily for plowing compared to an ox? If you put a donkey and an ox together, is that a real problem for the donkey? How does a donkey do that? And by the way, is it a problem for the ox too? The ox is going to be doing all the work, the donkey's riding along. So it says don't yoke an ox and a donkey because it's not fair to either animal. It's not fair to the animal to put this big honking ox with the donkey on a plowing thing like that. By the way, does this even come over into the New Testament? Does this even come over into the New Testament? In the New Testament it says, do not be what? Unequally yoked with unbelievers. And so do you see this crazy law with the ox and donkey? So it says that if you're a guy, don't marry a woman that reminds you of a donkey, or if you're married. Anyways, okay. That was really bad. Okay, let's back off on that one. But what it's saying in actually Paul in 2 Corinthians there is saying what? Believers should not be married with unbelievers. Do not unequally yoke. Do not unequally yoke and stuff. And so that he applies this law then to that situation. So don't link donkey and ox because it's not fair to the animal. Go over to chapter 25, verse 4 is an interesting one too on the animal situation. 25:4. Do not muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain. Okay, what happens? They take the stalks of grain, they cut down the wheat and barley, they lay it out, and the ox walks around on it. Now when he walks around on it, what does he do? His feet crush the grain, they've got these shucks around the kernel. The kernels are hard, the shucks are not. The ox walks its feet on it, and it basically shucks the grain, and then the people throw the grain up in the air and the chaff blows away. But the ox is the one through stepping on it that does that. Have any of you guys ever done black walnuts? On black walnuts, if you get black walnuts, you put them in your driveway and you drive your car over them. No, seriously. And you drive your car over them and it shucks the black walnuts. Okay? I'm experienced at this, okay? And because when I was younger, my father made me do it by hand and my hands were stained black, and every year I went to school with my hands in my pocket. And then we learned this trick about driving the car over it. It was really great. It was like an ox, but do you have to feed the ox? Yeah, you got to put gas in the tank. So anyways, but what's this mean, feeding the ox? It means the ox is doing work for you, and when somebody or an ox is doing work for you, do they get part of the grain for themselves? Is that fair to the ox, that the ox is doing all the work, that it gets some of the food? In other words, you got animals. Do you need to take care of your animals? Question, you got animals. Are you required by the law to take care of your animals? Yeah, they do the work for you. They get part of the take for themselves, okay? It's only fair. And so even the animals have rights in Scripture, Deuteronomy 25. And actually, I heard 3 years ago, I heard a woman do a lecture on animal laws in the book of Deuteronomy. And it was absolutely brilliant. It was just really interesting of all these laws that are in regard to animals. Does the Bible, this is terrible, does the Bible have a very high view of humankind? Yes, it does. But does the Bible also have a very high view of animals and animal treatment? Yeah, it does. Okay, so it's interesting. There's a couple laws, there's others and stuff. So